Hi, I'm Erin, and I'm going to be sharing my experiences as a first-time GA delegate. And to be honest, I was a bit reluctant to become a delegate since GA was going to be entirely virtual this year, and I knew that meant I'd be spending a lot of time in front of the computer or on the phone, and I wasn't sure how well I could focus for hours at a time on the content. But I'll say they did a great job of varying the content, encouraging us to step away as we needed to refresh. So from that perspective, it went really well. And although GA didn't begin officially until June 20th, I started to receive emails beginning in March, explaining how GA would run and offering sessions prior to that. So I was like, yikes, I'm not ready quite yet to dive into this, but it was helpful also to have Robin as a multi-year delegate to explain to me the difference between the business agenda and everything else. And the business agenda itself was around 12 hours over 4 days. So that in itself to me felt like a lot of time to be sitting in front of the computer. But I have to say, they after each of those business sessions, they give you an opportunity to vote. So and it was a fairly small window. So I had to be sure to be available and make sure that I could get my vote cast. And there definitely was a learning curve on my part to understand the various things I would be voting on. I know I'd heard in years past the terms of actions of immediate witness and responsive resolutions, and I didn't really know what that meant. And there were many, many programs and workshops outside of the business agenda. And I really, to be honest, didn't watch much of that because the business agenda and with everything else going on in our lives in the Berkshires in the summer kind of squeezed out some of the other content. But the good news is they do make it available to delegates afterward, I think through the rest of the summer, if I remember. So I started to go back and watch one or two that sound interesting to me. I would say in general, the whole process went really smoothly. They use Zoom, they use YouTube, they use an app called Wahova. What's it, Wahova, I think? Yeah. What is it?
I think it's safe.
Wahova. I'd never heard of it, but it seemed to work well as the platform you'd use to vote or to read up on some of the actual resolutions. And there were over, I think, 2,500 delegates and lots of opinions expressed. My expectation going in was that it was going to be, we were all sort of generally agreeing on the issues, which certainly wasn't the case at all. And I quickly learned how seriously people took these issues and was surprised to find out, too, that some of the congregations get their delegates together beforehand to decide how they're going to vote, and which wasn't the case here at all. And I was kind of glad for that because it gave me the freedom to vote how I felt after hearing the pros and cons of each of the issues. There was a constant, when the business agenda was going on and when people were talking, there was a constant stream of chat comments. And for me, it was to the point of distraction, and I was pleased as the meeting progressed that they made the decision to turn off the chat comments so that I could really focus on what the speaker was saying and not be reading what everybody's comments were about the speaker. And the speakers, and they work it well in terms of allowing you to talk for a very limited time frame, and you either set yourself up in the pro queue or the con queue, or what was it? It wasn't con, it was concerned, I think. Yeah, another way of saying con. And on a few occasions, even the moderators actually halted the conversations when they felt the dialogue was potentially hurtful to others. So that was surprising to me too, that people were expressing things in a way that at times you kind of cringe with some of the comments that were being said. But another thing that I hadn't expected. And I'm curious, how does that behavior, how does that compare with if you had gone in person to the session? Because I was thinking in my head, well, you wouldn't be having, sitting in the audience chatting about what the speaker's saying, you'd be listening versus typing in comments in real time. So in all, I think I found the experience very interesting. I learned a lot about the process, and it gave me a better sense of, the UU community overall versus just our congregation here. So I'm glad I participated. Mm-hmm.
Good morning.
So this was my 4th General Assembly as a delegate for UUMSB and my 5th General Assembly overall. And I think at each General Assembly that I go to, I'm always surprised at how difficult sometimes the debate can be, how contentious it can be. This one was maybe particularly that way because we had so many difficult issues to deal with. By now, you know that the delegates adopted changes to Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. This was a vote in favor of 2,025 delegates, or 80.2% of the delegates approved the changes. 19.8%, or 499, did not approve the changes, and just a handful abstained. This was the first major revision of Article 2 since 1987, so you can imagine there were a lot of comments leading up to GA, and really over the past 3+ years, we've been having this dialogue about whether we should make these changes. I'm sure that GA is not going to stop the dialogue, it will just continue to progress. The vote required 2/3 of the delegates voting, and so it was approved. We also did some other business that was really important, I think, for us as a denomination. For example, we adopted a business resolution. The resolution was entitled Embracing Transgender, Non-Binary, Intersex, and Gender-Diverse People is a Fundamental Expression of UU Religious Values. The business resolution is important because it guides the UUA board and the staff in their external relations around issues of LGBTQ, and this resolution was adopted overwhelmingly. We also adopted an action of immediate witness on asking President Biden to declare that climate change, the climate crisis, is a national crisis. And we adopted another action of immediate witness expressing solidarity with the Palestinians. We also adopted a responsive resolution calling for the immediate release of all Hamas-held hostages and acknowledging the suffering of Jews within our association and beyond. Prior to GA, the week before GA, we had 2 mini-assemblies. And so we actually didn't start just with GA. We started beforehand, and we took some pretty critical votes during that time. We had some amendments that related to the way that the rules of procedure were going to progress during the GA debate. And so we adopted one amendment allowing the person who introduces a proposed amendment to have time to close, to clarify any misstatements during the debate or to answer questions. We considered another amendment that would have increased the amount of time that a person has to speak from 90 seconds to 150 seconds. And 90 seconds doesn't seem very long, but when you start to think about the volume of people who spoke, we had almost 200 people who signed up in the pro and con lines to speak during the 4 days of debate. And not all of those people spoke, but about half of them did. And so when you start to add up 150 seconds per person, it really becomes very unmanageable, and it would have added a significant amount of time to the overall debate. So as Erin noted, it's always surprising to see how people think about things. I think I have a tendency to think as a UU that everybody thinks the same way that I do, and that we have the same values. And that's not necessarily the case. I found the debate oftentimes very contentious. I found the chat, as Erin was suggesting, just horrible. There were horrible things said in the chat, and so it was really nice when they disabled it. But I think the debate, as difficult as it can be, is really critical to the process. It was important for me in a couple of ways. The first thing that it did was it really helped to eliminate issues that I might not have considered in thinking about these various proposals that we were voting on. For example, the business resolution. I ended up voting for an amendment to the business resolution that I didn't think was necessary at all. I thought that the proposed amendment, which was just inserting some language suggesting that UU congregations support other UU congregations. And I thought, well, that's really encompassed within this business resolution. We really don't need this language. But what really changed my opinion was a religious educator from Oklahoma who stood up and identified himself as a member of the LGBTQ+ community and said that this language was so important for them to be able to do their advocacy in a very conservative state. And so for that reason, I said, well, I can accept that and I can vote for it. And like many of the other delegates, we voted for it and approved it. A second thing that I think the debate does is that it really helps us to sort of arrive at consensus on difficult issues. And so we had before us an action of immediate witness on Palestine and on solidarity of Palestine. It was an action of immediate witness that was not perfect in its drafting at all. And I thought as I read it, I don't know how I can vote for this. But then in the final days of debate, a responsive resolution was offered in support of Israel. And it too was not perfect. But when you looked at the two together, you could say, okay, we can do this, and we can craft a statement for the UUA so that we're on record. And so, again, those two pieces passed overwhelmingly. And then finally, there's Article 2. And there were only 4 amendments to Article 2 that made it to the General Assembly. So there was this long process beforehand where people could offer amendments. They were debated, and 4 finally made it. So these amendments were amendments that had large support of congregations. They encompassed many other amendments, so a lot of amendments were consolidated into these 4. And going into it, we received so much information, not only about what the amendments said and how they would change the proposed statement, but about what other delegates were thinking. And so you consume all of this information and you go in sort of thinking, well, this is how I'm going to vote. There are 4 amendments. They all seem reasonable to me. I think I could vote for all of them. And I came away voting for just 1. After I listened to the debate and heard what people had to say, I really came away saying, well, there's 1 that I can approve and the other 3 I can't. Again, that was the overwhelming majority of delegates who felt that way. So I think that what the debate does is help us sort of gain a better understanding of what people are thinking, because we're not a denomination where we all think alike. And people have different thoughts about what needs to go in to a proposed change and what doesn't need to go in. And so it gives you a way to begin to process the just tremendous amount of information that you're dealing with. And so as a delegate, I would do it again. I've done it 5 times now. I would do it again. I think it's tremendously helpful to understanding how we fit within the broader UU denomination. I think it's always good to realize that although we have a lot of things that we agree on and that we value, we don't always think alike. And so we need to recognize that there are other people in our denomination that think differently than us. So I would highly recommend it to any of you who want to do it next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Our reading this morning is a story that I've told before, but it's about the Cambridge platform, so I feel like it might not have stuck with everybody. This story of the Cambridge platform is written by some old friends of mine from seminary, Jackie Clement and Allison Cornish. And it's in a UUA curriculum called Faith Like a River. I adapted it just slightly to explain some of the words they use. In 1637, white settlers in what was to become the town of Dedham, Massachusetts, wanted to start a church. The problem was the roughly 30 families didn't know each other, and therefore they didn't know what sort of church to begin. They began a year-long series of cottage meetings, each organized around discussion of a particular question. We might think that in order to know each other's religious views and needs, these New England ancestors might choose topics like salvation and damnation, predestination, or morality, but they did not. What they mostly discussed were matters of civil organization, for in their understanding, the church would reflect the ethic of the larger society, and what they longed for was sincere religious association based in love and founded in freedom. In the England they had left behind, these meetings would have been illegal. The bishops of the English churches had begun to crack down on ministers, scholars, and lay people who looked at the lessons of the Bible stories in a political and social light. Discontent grew not with the church theology so much as with the ecclesiastical structure that dictated every facet of local church affairs. The idea of a free church took shape among the people, a church whose individual congregations were controlled by no outside authority. This was the sort of church the small group in Dedham, Massachusetts, decided to build. It was a church much like its neighbors and much like the other churches that would be built in New England in the coming decades, a radically lay-led church, gathered by mutual consent rather than by mutual belief, founded in covenant or promises made to each other rather than creed, and governed by the congregation itself, not the state and not the larger church. Now, make no mistake, this group did not hold widely varying theological beliefs that would have made it unable to exist as a creedal church. But their belief that churches should be self-governing organizations gathered in the spirit of mutual love was paramount. This basis for gathering and governing a church by congregational determination was described 10 years after the founding of the Dedham Church in a document known commonly as the Cambridge Platform. Or more formally, this name is beautiful, a platform of church discipline gathered out of the Word of God and agreed upon by the elders and messengers of the churches assembled in the Synod at Cambridge in New England. The Cambridge Platform trips off the tongue much easier. And it defined congregational polity. Based in the Calvinist theology of the Puritans, it set out a structure for churches founded on New Testament descriptions of early churches. It defined matters of church officers, ministry, membership, and cooperation between churches. Although changes in practice were being made as early as the second generation, the Cambridge Platform remains a defining document for the denominations, including Unitarian Universalism, that continue to practice congregational polity. Of the 65 congregations that voted to ratify the platform in 1648, 21 are members of the Unitarian Universalist Association today. In our questions service last week, Al Blake asked if Unitarian Universalism was experiencing a decline like many other denominations. I hadn't looked at the numbers lately, which is what I said last week, so this week I looked them up. And our number of adult members has been about the same, within 10 or 20,000 adults, since we began in 1961. But COVID was a big hit for us. 30 congregations have closed in the last 4 years. And we are down to our lowest membership census count since we became the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961. We have 1,000 congregations with approximately 130,000 adult members and 23,000 children in religious education. For some benchmarking to close neighbors, the United Church of Christ, or the UCC, has about 5,000 congregations in the US and 750,000 members. And the Friends, or Quakers, are at about 75,000 in the United States, though many 100,000 abroad. The entire Unitarian Universalist Association is roughly the size of Berkshire County, or the city of Springfield, Massachusetts. So, when we send 3,500 delegates to do the business of our denomination, It is a significant representation of our congregations, about 3% of our membership. Our US Congress is 535 people to represent 333 million, or 0.0000016% of our population. Being in community with one another and doing governance work in congregations is a challenge. And I think we here do a pretty good job of it. Across our denomination, it's more people, right? So it's a bigger challenge because we are human and we care a lot about the outcomes of our decisions together. And sometimes, as you heard, things can get heated and uncomfortable. I sometimes get really frustrated that in a denomination as small as ours, we can get distracted by fighting about nonsense and struggle with communicating with one another. But then I think about the size of Berkshire County or Springfield, Massachusetts. Folks in these places also have shared experience of living as neighbors and, of course, disagree on policy, law, education, values, anything you might imagine. We have some shared experience and a lot of difference as well. And so with this in mind, this is why congregational polity, designed about 400 years ago here in Massachusetts, is so important to our community and denomination. Even with our small numbers, we will not all use the same language for describing our experience and beliefs. We have different theologies, and we need to come to agreements about how we will make decisions together and how we will be in relationship to one another within and among congregations. We went through a rigorous multi-year process to update some of the language for these relationships across the denomination in our UUA bylaws, specifically the part that talks about our shared values, formally described as our principles. This language is important because it's the foundation upon which we are in relationship among congregations throughout our association. It's the language we will use to talk about values that will shape our collective decision-making and programming in the denomination. It's not a creed, but it is a covenant. Promises made among congregations in good faith. I was worried about the debate coming when I was getting ready for General Assembly. I had a whole series of items around me so that I could distract myself with while I was listening so that I wouldn't get all worked up. There were individuals and congregations that worried about that the language changes would impact their own theological freedom. There were many people and organizations who felt these changes offered language that was inclusive and accessible and useful. Personally, I like that it starts with a series of words. It's an elevator speech that sort of writes itself. Here's my shorthand. In Unitarian Universalism, we value and accountably work toward interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice, centered in love. And then the text expands with detail on what we mean by those words and what we are covenanting to do in order to do the work. I think it's a helpful frame, and it doesn't mean that the 7 or 8 principles are gone. Lots of folks find those texts helpful and will continue to use them. So I was worried that we were going to have a lot of conflict and that it was going to be tough. And while some folks said some things that were hard, it actually was a pretty respectful debate. We talked about amendments, we voted, and then we voted on the final draft. And as Robin noted, it passed roughly 80% to 20%. That does mean, though, that there were a significant number of delegates who were disappointed. And I hope that over time, we'll smooth some of that out. There were some other debates and behaviors that didn't go as well. And we don't need to talk that through right now, but I think what it helps to us to remember is that when we gather as Unitarian Universalists, we might imagine that our own experience and language and understanding is pretty similar to everyone else's, but it's not. General Assembly is a reminder that though we are small in relative size, we have a wide theological and experiential tent. And that is important to consider as we make decisions together as a large body and also here in our congregation. Every time we gather, our leadership tries to set us up for success with guidelines, suggestions for self-care, norm setting, and over time, even when it's cringy and tough, we are trying to continue to be in right relationship with one another and stay connected across difference. And we'll keep trying. Over this next year, I'll be spending some sermon time each month on the new shared values language. And then once we go through those, we'll go on to more parts of the update. I'm looking forward to digging in with all of you to see what we might find in this new language that is helpful to us here. Next year, General Assembly will be hybrid, with some folks in person in Baltimore and others online. And even if you're not a delegate for our congregation next year, but I encourage you to consider it, I also encourage you to learn more about General Assembly and maybe check out a few of the debates, which you can watch for free on YouTube, to get a sense of what this challenge of being a liberal faith together is all about. Amen, and so may it be.